Hello, everybody, and welcome. I'm going to be today talking about what I researched for my project, and that was the Great Leap Forward. I'm going to be talking about the historical events of it, the impact it had on humans, and also the impact it had on the environment. So, the Great Leap Forward, in my opinion, is one of the most important events in modern history. It completely changed China from basically like a farming nation, agriculture based, to industrialized, like urbanized nation, like how it is today. So the program was created by the communist leader Mao Zedong. The plan was for it to be 5 years from 1958 to 1963. And as I stated before, it would transform from an agriculture-based society to a industrialized society. So I guess the policies they implemented, one of them, they want to turn it like a completely communist nation. That was like one of the steps they wanted to take. So they completely privatized all farming and turned it into collective farming. So that basically means that there was no like private land ownership, and the government had control of all of like the food and income that came from the food, and they could just distribute it how they wish, um, and basically turn like completely communist. But it turns out that the Great Leap Forward was a massive failure, and it was canceled only after 3 years. Today it remains the largest non-war killing in human history. It's estimated that between 30 million and 45 million people died during that time. And so I'll get into some of the policies right now about how it affected the environment. So the first policy was called the Great Cutting, and there were three different eras of the Great Cutting. And the Great Cutting was basically just a movement to just have mass deforestation, to use the wood for different purposes and to use the land for different purposes. So the first era of the Great Cutting was between 1958 and 1962. The policy was to cut down trees to use their lumber for the backyard steel furnaces, which were to increase iron production. So the backyard steel furnaces were basically in villages or towns. People would have these like decently sized furnaces in their backyard, and they would essentially just use it for iron. And they just, because the country, as I'll get into a little bit later, just wanted to like mass output iron, so they needed the wood to burn so they could like melt the iron down. So that was the first era. The second period of the Great Cuttings was between 1966 and 1976. And so that era was was basically for the lumber to be used for train tracks, which could transport like goods, also make new infrastructure, as well as making new machinery. And the deforestation obviously helped with making more land for like factories and new towns. And then the final era between 1978 and 1988 allowed, basically, this was back to when China allowed private businesses, because it was about 20 years later after the Great Leap Forward. Private businesses needed space, to work. So it was basically just mass deforestation just to create room. So even though that was kind of what the first two were, there were other purposes, such as like the lumber was used for a lot of different things, but this one was just strictly use it for land. So obviously, when you deforest a ton, there's like a lot of negative effects. For the first one, like tree roots really kind of hold soil together, and when they're deforested, like a lot of erosion happens. And so there was like a ton of flooding during like the time, and basically like the trees just like couldn't stop it. And like when there was a lot of rain, like the soil and the roots, like it couldn't like hold together, so there'd be a lot of flooding. that obviously led to like the destruction of homes and farmland. And it also, obviously, trees are a big component for removing air pollution. So that's what we'll get into next. But, you know, a lot of air pollution occurs when there's just no trees. So air pollution wise, the negative effects it had on the environment was, as I touched before, the backyard furnaces, obviously pumping out just carbon dioxide to create this iron production would have a negative effect on the air. Some like accounts say that like the villages like glowed red and the nation was dipped into a sea of fire just because it was based like some of the villages were just like you would think that like it was completely burned down with just like the smoke and stuff being produced. Also, for air pollution, it's estimated that during the time in like 1961, there was 310,000 factories and 59,000 coal mines, along with other entities. So just massive like production, things that cause a bunch of air pollution and just not good for the environment. And then obviously getting rid of the trees didn't help. And then the final movement was referred to as the Four Pests campaign. This is probably the most famous. Basically, they wanted to eliminate four pests, which included rats, mosquitoes, flies, and most famously sparrows. They didn't like them like ruining like crops and stuff like that. So the main target was the sparrows, who would eat the grains in the fields that they were growing. So the government ordered people to basically go out and kill them. And the way they did that was they would bring out pots and pans, and where like a sparrow's nest where it was in the tree, they would just like bang it as loud as they could, make the sparrows fly up in the air. And then they would keep doing that until the sparrows basically just like died from exhaustion. So they would fall from the sky and then they would die on impact because they wouldn't land because they would be so scared of like the loud noises. And so the Four Pest campaign, it's estimated that it killed 1.5 billion pounds of rats, 1 billion pounds of sparrows, over 220 pounds of flies, and 24 million pounds of mosquitoes. So just a complete, almost like genocide of killing these animals. And the effect was not what they thought it would be. So initially, they wanted to get rid of the sparrows because they believed they would be eating the grain, which it was, but it turns out the sparrows did a lot more. So they would eat the lotus. That's an insect that sparrows, that's like the lotus's main predator. Predator is like the sparrow. So without the sparrows, it basically just exploded in population size with nothing to regulate its population. And basically what happened was the lotus just like they grew and then they just like destroyed all of the farmland, like destroyed all of the crops, and it basically just ruined the entire like food population of the entire nation. So it's estimated that the food population killed between 15 and 36 million, and that's the greatest famine in the history of mankind by a lot. And like the actions taken by like the Chinese government, just it caused so many like negative impacts that they just didn't account for. Like they thought they would like be fixing this like problem they thought they had, but it just turned out to be way worse. And it ultimately like just created a big famine, and it just completely messed up like the ecosystem. So in conclusion, the Great Leap Forward was a complete failure. It had so many negative impacts from the environment. Obviously, deforestation led to floods and poor air quality. You know, air pollution happened because of the just like amount of just chemicals being pumped into the air by the production. and then the mass killing of animals and insects happened because of just the Four Pests campaign. So it was just a complete disaster, and when you look back on it, it was just a terrible time for the environment, but it was ultimately one of the most important events in history of mankind.